Welcome to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, it's Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist podcast, the show where great dentistry meets great business. In today's bite-sized episode, we're talking about multiple practice ownership versus single practice ownership. And we're going to get into that conversation, and it's a bit of a conversation where angels fear to tread, to be honest with you, because there's such strong views on both sides of the argument. So in this short episode, I want to give you just a couple of things to consider if you're thinking about going from one to multiple practices. And of course, there is no one right answer here. There are some people that, are going to be able to achieve everything they want to achieve with one practice. And similarly, there'll be others that want to have multiple practices. And we've got clients that do both models really well. So let me share a few things that I've been thinking about just in preparation for today's podcast. So when it comes to choosing whether to go down the multiple practice ownership path or to stick with one, I guess the first thing I'd say to you is you've got to be really clear about your outcome. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And when it comes to business outcomes, we often talk about three currencies, and we talk about money, we talk about time, and we talk about meaning. And all of those things are really important in life. So you've got to have enough money to do the things you need to do to live. You want to have enough time to enjoy your life and to do the things you want to do with the people you want to do them with. And equally with meaning, we want to always feel like we're giving back and we're making a contribution beyond ourselves. And we know that when you get those three currencies in the right mix, life is very rewarding. And in fact, that's really our definition of a scaled practice. And to talk about that just for a moment, I believe that the word scaling has been misappropriated, much like the word entrepreneur has been. But scaling is sometimes used to refer to, having, a bazillion different practices across a bazillion different countries and bazillion different continents. It's about more and more and bigger and more and bigger again, where it doesn't need to be that. So for me, the definition of a scaled practice is one where you have money, you have time, and you have meaning in the quantities that make sense for you. And so again, to be clear at the outset, you need to know what your goal is. And then from there, it's about choosing the business model or the pathway that's going to help you achieve that goal. And I can't overstate the importance of clarity, because one of the things that I've observed in recent times, and in general, I suppose, is that clarity is often the hardest thing. It sounds so simple to go, what do you want to achieve? And we think that we know, and sometimes we do really know, but other times we think certain things or we think we want certain things, and it doesn't always work out to be the case that that's indeed what we want. And when we're not clear about what we want, we do get into this potential for comparison and feeling like we should go down one path or the other because that's, what everyone else is doing, or that's what success looks like on someone else's, definition. So just to speak to this point for a moment, I don't want to start this conversation thinking I've got an agenda one way or the other, because I really don't. I'm really just here to say you can go down either path, both will work, but there are a few things you're going to need to think about. The trap I really just want to alert people to, though, up front, is that in some cases, I see people going down the multiple practice ownership path because they think that they should, or because they think that's a definition of success, or because they want to have the kudos of owning 2 or 3 practices. And, if that's important to you for those reasons, then that's fine. I'm not here to judge or knock anyone for that. What I am going to say, though, is to be really clear about your outcome and to get to your outcome as simply and as safely as possible, because in my experience that, having multiple practices doesn't mean you've got multiple profitable practices. And I think the emphasis there is on profitable. The last thing we want to do is inadvertently create what I call the Cinderella syndrome, where you've got one really good practice and a couple of ugly stepsisters that take away your focus and your energy and your time from the main game, which is your great practice. So if you're going to go down multiple practices, I just want to state up front, I'm working off the premise of having multiple profitable practices, but I want to alert you to the fact that the risk is having multiple mediocre or multiple unprofitable practices that is a bit of a millstone around your neck. And in fact, just while we're on that topic, I've seen quite recently 1 or 2 people who've had 3 or 4 or 5 practices even that are, 1 or 2 chairs in each location. And that's like having 4 or 5 part-time jobs because they're trying to go from each location to do the dentistry still. And that's crazy, right? And so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, multiple practices that have got the opportunity and the ability to have capacity and leverage and all those sorts of things in there to make it work. So anyway, that preamble aside, rule number 1 is to know your outcome, and rule number 2 is to choose a business model that'll help you achieve that outcome in the simplest and safest way. One of the things that I see all the time is that people take risks unnecessarily, and I'm all for taking considered risks. But if I don't need to take a risk, I don't want to take a risk, right? So we want to minimize risk and eliminate risk if we can. So choose the model that's going to get you your goal simply and safely. And if you need to take a risk, make sure you've considered it and make sure you've mitigated it. So let's talk about single practices for the moment, because that's probably an obvious place to start. So some of the advantages of a single practice or a single site is clearly it's simpler and easier to have things under one roof. You can still scale that. You can still create capacity under one roof. You could have a practice with 6 chairs, 8 chairs, 9 chairs, 10 chairs, however many chairs. And so for most people, you can achieve pretty much all your goals under one roof. Now, that's not going to be true for every single person, but for most people, I would say most people's goals could be achieved, with one practice, and that's fine, as long as you have capacity there. And so what I would say is that really, when it comes to this type of practice, in theory, it's less risky. Now, I've just said to you, choose your path that's easiest, safest, with least risk. And I've led into talking about single practices. Single practices, in theory, are less risky because you're not, spreading your assets too thin. You're not spreading your energy too thin, and so on and so forth. But a single practice can be risky if it's set up in a really poor area. If you've got one practice and you've set up in an uber competitive area and, it's an area that's going to get more and more competition, is becoming increasingly saturated, then sure, there's clearly risk around that. So when it comes to a single practice, some of the disadvantages are you obviously have limited growth, because once you hit capacity, you hit capacity. And, once you hit the capacity, then you can try and do all sorts of fun things like expand your operating hours, get more out of the day, and so on and so forth, which we call juicing the orange. But there comes a point where you can't expand your capacity any further and you hit that ceiling. And so that means you do have that situation. But again, for most people, that's not a big deal. For most people, if they've built a profitable practice under one roof, then that's great. The main thing is that if you want to create time freedom, you need to have enough ability to have enough leverage into your practice. And so it's going to look, you're going to need to look at your chairs, the amount of chairs you've got, the capacity you've got, and so on. So again, just be really clear about that outcome again. So let's just put the single practice aside for a moment. When it comes to multiple practices, the big advantages there are you've got more capacity for leverage, more seats under management, more chairs under management. So in theory, more revenue, greater leverage, which should give you more income, it should give you more time, and so on and so forth. The other advantage of multiple practices is, in theory, you can roll them up for a big exit. Now, of course, the challenge with that, though, is you have a much smaller pool of buyers for such a big enterprise. So if you're going to be selling that, you might be selling to a corporate if they're in the market for practices, and that's a big if at the moment. Or you might need to, break those practices up and sell them to associates later. But in any event, the potential for a bigger exit is there. But I would say in most cases, a single practice is probably easier to sell than multiples. When it comes to multiple practices, as I've alluded to, the Cinderella process or the Cinderella syndrome is a real challenge. And this is where I see most people going wrong with multiple practices. When you've got that situation, you've got too many fixed costs across multiple locations, which means you've got lots of fixed costs and not enough leverage to be able to, surpass those costs easily. Clearly, it's more complicated. Clearly, as you do add more practices into the mix, you're going to have more complex situations. But as I said, if you can manage this, and we've got lots of clients that do management, you can do really well with it. So let me share with you a few things that you're going to need to nail down if you decide to go down the multiple practice path. If you look at your goals and you look at your aspiration, you think, really for me to achieve this, Jesse, I really need to have 2, 3, 4 practices. Then let me share a few things that I've observed from people who do this very well. The thing I've observed really well is perhaps their number one skill is their ability to build and lead great teams. They've figured out that it's a who, not how problem. So their skill that they've really mastered is the ability to recruit great people, to be able to onboard people well, to train those people well, to be able to get them up to speed and productive really quickly, and then of course retain their very best people. In amongst all that, they've had to develop some leadership skills, so they've been able to set the vision for the practice and enroll the team into that vision. And if you want to have multiple practices, then this is absolutely critical. If you want to have a single practice, this is super important too, but it is absolutely critical if you're going to go down the multi-practice path. Equally, if you're going to go down the multi-practice path, you're going to absolutely need some more sophisticated management structures and organizational structure. So in a smaller practice or one practice, you can probably have slightly looser organizational structures. But even as you get bigger under one roof, you're going to need to have some more structure there. But if you don't have structure in multiple practices, that lack of structure will absolutely kill you. So if you're going to have this structure, you're going to need to have a key person in each location. And you'll probably need a manager that sits across the group of practices. Your job will be to build and lead that team. So you'll need to have key person meetings with obviously the group manager and probably with the individual leaders on each site as well. And so that means that you're still going to need to be present. Perhaps your role might change from being fully clinical, but of course, your role now changes to being the leader of the team and the visionary and so on and so forth. With a multiple practice ownership situation and indeed a large single practice, your primary revenue is going to come from others. So your ability to have productive clinicians in those chairs is going to be key. You're going to need to make sure that there's, billing and monetary things going through the doors, because what you don't want, as I've said earlier, is you don't want to have these fixed expenses and underutilized assets in terms of chairs, sitting there. So you've got to manage that asset very, very well. With a single practice, one of the advantages, of course, is that you can hop in a chair there as well. And you can do that in a multiple practice situation, of course, but again, you won't be able to be across everything if you're spending hands in mouth in one location. So if you do have one location, I think it's easier for you to still be a clinician than it is for you to be in multiple locations. Now, again, that's not a hard and fast rule, because I know other practitioners who do the multi-practice ownership model really, really well, and they still practice. But as the complexity increases, you need to have these other structures in place to support you. So coming back to the very beginning of this, I would say it's super, super important for you to know your outcome. Super important to think about, what you want in terms of money, time, and meaning, to choose a model that's going to get you there in the simplest way possible with the least amount of complexity that you need, because life is too short to have too much complexity, and perhaps that's a little bit of life experience shining through there. If you're going to be going down the multiple practice ownership path, that's absolutely cool. There's plenty of ways you can do it well, because you can get more leverage, you can roll it up, you can get a potentially bigger exit, even with a smaller pool of buyers. But you're going to need to be really good at building teams, leading teams. You're going to need to be really good at your operational processes and systems. You're going to need to be great at retaining your best people. You're going to need to be great at managing your finances and keeping your fixed expenditure down. And you're going to need to have enough capacity in each site to make each site profitable in and of itself. So you don't want to be carrying a couple of ugly stepsisters, as I mentioned earlier. So there's some thought starters for you. Again, no one right way, plenty of ways to get to the top of the mountain, but you've just got to choose the right way for you. So I hope there's some thought starters there for you. Look forward to hearing from you, and we'll talk soon. Take care. Bye now.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.